Hello, everybody. You're listening to Chris Hattingh, researcher at the Free Market Foundation. Thank you so much for joining me on this, my latest solo podcast. Now, I've been thinking for a while about doing a series possibly on essays and articles, maybe longer sort of research journal entries on objectivism. And objectivism is the philosophy, the system of thought that was formulated by the writer and philosopher Ayn Rand. She was a Russian who moved to the United States and wrote many famous books, some of which some of you might have read before, such as Atlas Shrugged, The Fountainhead, and Anthem. Her work has had a profound interest on my personal and professional career thus far. I always made a big point of presenting her work at university, of writing on her works in my philosophy classes. And now, when I write articles and do interviews, I try and remember some of what she wrote and what she said. A lot of what she talks about, I think, is very important. The importance of ideas on how one acts every day. I think your personal philosophy is a good indicator of how you're going to act. And I think nowadays we don't pay nearly enough attention to the philosophy behind people's actions. We get surprised when a certain political party does something and we don't read their manifestos and what the words and concepts mean. Whereas if we spent some more time, I think, talking about philosophy, discussing its impact and such, we might not feel so sort of helpless, I guess, in a way. Now, the essay I've chosen to talk about today is titled The Inverted Moral Priorities. You can find that in a collection of her essays. That collection is called The Voice of Reason. And in this particular essay, she's talking about economic spending, saving, these sorts of economic terms, and their ties with morality. I think for a lot of us, we think economics is cold and devoid of we shouldn't discuss morality linked with economics, but I think there's a very intimate tie. How you view human beings, if you view them as good or bad, how you view individuals, how you view the role of the state, all of this has an impact on the sort of economics that you propose, whether you're an Austrian, for example, or a Keynesian, maybe a redistributionist. All of these things are influenced. Your whole system of economics is influenced by your view of man, and of how people act, how they ought to act, what is moral, what is immoral, etc. Now, in this essay, Rand, near the beginning, she discusses the great importance of production in itself. The fact that in order to live, we each need to produce wealth for ourselves. In more primitive societies, people produced, just basic things that they needed. For example, they built shelters. So people had certain roles in their tribes and their communities. Some produced produce in the form of vegetables, that kind of thing. Others were the hunter-gatherers, and they fulfilled that role. But the point is that we have to produce in order to live. That might be a very scary thought for some people. For some people, that might be why they are advocates for a big state, why there needs to be a lot of spending, because they don't think people should be responsible for their own sort of lives and their own well-being. But this is a point that Rand sort of starts off discussing. She points to the great importance of labor, how we know capitalists and investors, they might have more capital invest, but at the end of the day, there's going to be an implementation of those ideas. You can't have a business without capital, and you also can't have a business without labor. You need both. I might have great ideas, but if I can't put those into practice, if I can't actually action them, they're not going to serve my life and the furthering of my life. I could have very great business ideas, but I need to put in the work to make sure that those things are realized. Just to quote from Rand from this essay, and one of the important points that she makes first of all is on the importance of saving. And I quote, "Deferred consumption, i.e. savings, on a gigantic scale is required to keep industrial production going. Savings pay for machines which enable men to produce in a day an amount of goods they would not be able to produce by hand in a year, if at all. This enables the workers in turn to defer consumption and to save some of their income for their future needs or goals. The hallmark of an industrial society is its members' distance from a hand-to-mouth mode of living. The greater this distance, the greater men's progress." End quote. Now, think about South Africa as, keep South Africa in mind the whole time when you're listening to these sorts of more philosophical, abstract thoughts and ideas. For many people in South Africa, many people who are still poor after apartheid in 1994, they have to live sort of day by day, hand to mouth, because of the weakening of the rand, because of all sorts of big government programs which have weakened the rand over the years. People's money doesn't go nearly as far as it used to. They have to pay more for petrol, for example. They have to pay higher taxes. All of this stuff when they travel to work, sort of, from the outskirts of Johannesburg, for example, they have to travel very far. They have to pay a lot for public transport, and that in turn takes away their ability to save because they simply have to focus on getting food day to day for themselves and for their families. And I think this is, a big indictment of South Africa currently is, I think, the fact that we're generally not saving as much as we probably should and as we used to in the past. Saving is very, very important. Vicious life in a way. You're gonna wake up the next, every day just worrying about what you're gonna do for that day, where your money is gonna come from, what you're going to do. You might resort to more desperate measures to get that money, for example, stealing, that kind of thing, just because you need to fulfill your needs and your wants in that particular point in time. You simply don't have enough to save, and then in that way by saving you can at least put some things on sort of the back burner and just focus on the day to day. And I think this is a crucial aspect that Rand highlights about more industrialized, progressive societies where people are able to save more, which unfortunately is not the case in South Africa. Now, for all of people's talk about white monopoly capital, and we know that Oxfam every year comes out with their inequality report. They cry about the continued widening gap between rich and poor and why this is morally so bad. In this essay, Rand points out that the major part of a country's savings comes from the middle class, and how well the middle class is doing. Without the middle class being able to invest and save, it's not going to grow. People aren't going to move upwards, either from the sort of lower income classes into the middle class, or from the middle classes into what we call the rich. I think this is a link that I'm drawing on my own from what I've read here and in other places, but your ability to save indicates maybe your station in life better than the amount of goods you have. If you're able to save more, to defer your spending more, that probably shows a better level of responsibility and planning on your side than it would if you, for example, had a big mansion and a Lamborghini kind of thing that we usually associate with wealth. And here, this ties into what Rand says about people who, when we read the news and we're surprised, or for some of us, we're upset about the amount of wealth that the rich have, and we see how much our own savings are dwindling, we're upset. We think that those people took that money from someone else. That's, for example, why Oxfam's narrative is so successful. There's an assumption that because some are rich and successful, it's because they stole that money from other people. But as Rand, tries to elucidate in this piece, for a lot of people, it's not explained, what effect government policies have on their money. They assume that, they're having a very hard time, having a very hard life, trying to be successful to increase their wealth kind of thing, because, let's say a rich white man who owns a lot of supermarkets, for example, took money from them. There's no correlation for them between economic policies of a government and their own hard situation in life. It's very easy for them to see on the news, a rich person with a big mansion, and then to link that with their own unfortunate misfortune in life. And I'm going to quote Rand again here on this point, and she says, and I quote, "No one tells her," that's the housewife, "that higher taxes imposed on the rich and the semi-rich will not come out of their consumption expenditures, but out of their investment capital, i.e. their savings. That such taxes will mean less investment, i.e. less production, fewer jobs, higher prices for scarcer goods, and that by the time the rich have to lower their standard of living, hers will be gone, along with her savings and her husband's job. And no power in the world, no economic power, will be able to revive the dead industries. There will be no such power left." Now, this is absolutely crucial, I think, for South Africa. These government policies, for example, the biggest one that jumps into my mind is expropriation of property without compensation. This is actively driving away investors from South Africa, both local and foreign. It hasn't been, the amendment to Section 25 of the Constitution has not been ratified, drawn up and accepted yet by the Parliament. Now that the elections are over, we'll see a new cabinet and a new Parliament very soon. So we'll see if they push through with this and what sort of language they use. But that talk for the last 2 years, maybe a little bit longer, about expropriation of property, I think is having a very, very real effect on people's lives right now. It gives investors very little reason to invest in South Africa if we grant the state the power to take their property at any point. And this isn't to say that, I'm worried about the ANC being in power, or the EFF, or the Democratic Alliance, for example. Once we grant the government this kind of power, it doesn't matter who's in power. It can be any of those in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And once they have that power to take our property, we're going to allow them to do that kind of thing. We're granting them that sort of moral. We're saying it's morally okay for them to take our property because we've now amended the constitution. We've diluted property rights and what they mean for our lives. We've said that the state is above our individual property rights, and if it deems, I don't know, white people's property as superfluous, or Zulu people, or Xhosa people, or Venda, or Indian people, any group, maybe gay people, maybe a certain religious portion of society, if they think those people aren't entitled to that property, then they can take it. So we shouldn't think it's a case of if this party comes into power or that party comes into power, it's going to be bad. It's bad in and of itself. It's bad as a matter of principle. Okay, let's come back to Rand's essay here. You also have to think about, I'll tie this back to the discussion on equality and CEOs and people higher up in businesses earning so much money. No, we think that's bad, but they get remunerated that much because of all the decisions they have to take into account, what they have to do with their investors' money. They have to make seriously difficult decisions with that money and make sure that they take the right decisions, otherwise they'll get fired. There's a lot at stake for them, and it's a big deal for an investor to either invest in starting a new business or to continue growing one. And the more risk factors that are involved, for example, expropriation, higher taxes, labor regulation, the difficulty in South Africa of starting a business is very high. The more reasons there are for investors not to invest in a country, the greater the chance that they're going to take it elsewhere. They might simply find that other countries are better for their money. A lot of developing countries around the world now are trying to appear more attractive to investors, and South Africa is going in the opposite direction. We're trying to seemingly make it more difficult for them. We don't seem to want to heed the lessons of history, both the economic and the moral lessons, that the freer you let people be, the more the economy is going to grow. We seem to want to ignore that completely. And that's, it's very sad. And at the end of the day, it has the biggest effect on poorer people because their savings dwindle and they can't buy as much as they used to because investors have also left. Investors have no reason to invest. Their businesses will not grow. The services and goods will drop a lot, and that lowers the options for consumers. And the fewer options there are, the higher the prices become, etc., etc. And it becomes more and more difficult for people to live good lives. And then I just wanted to finish off with a final point Rand makes in her essay on the matter of representatives in society who represents different groups of people and what they say in society. So she talks about, for example, businessmen, those representatives, they are generally, she gives an example of a conference, but these men are generally the most quiet. They don't make noise. They try and make no demands on government and on people. They sort of accept the blame that's laid on them and then just move on from that. And that sort of moral abdication, which I think I would definitely like to talk about in a future podcast, and I think is very important, especially in South Africa, how business thinks it's inherently immoral, that what it does is immoral, but it should actually stand up for what it does. Just the last point Rand makes about representatives, she talks about the representatives of the men who contribute nothing. Quote, the welfare recipients, the professional consumerists, the non-producers, the objects of public charity, were the loudest, the most aggressive, the most self-righteously arrogant and hostile, end quote. Now these, I think, are easy to identify in South Africa. The politicians who talk the most about how government needs to spend, how government needs to help people, how government needs to get involved. Usually those are the ones who talk the most, especially before elections. They try and convince people that government is the only way that they can move up in life. They need government to help them to take from others to give to them. The redistributionists are usually the loudest. They try and convince people to give up more of their own rights to the government so the government can step in and do the right thing to that effect. And I'm sure for many of you, those representatives will be very easy to identify most of the time, if not every day. Almost weekly, it's something that we encounter. So all in all, as with most of, if not all of Rand's essays, there's so much that one can unpack and apply to today's society and the context of South Africa. I think it's vital that we try and push some sort of revival of individualism in the country, because South Africa has been dominated by groupthink and collectivism throughout its history. We haven't really had a period of individualism, and I think the situation we're in now shows us the effect of that philosophy. As I mentioned at the beginning, Rand, her view of ideas and philosophy and the vital importance thereof is something I very much believe in, and which I hope to bring out in my writings and when I do these podcasts and talking about things in general. And I think it's vital that we have these sorts of discussions, that we always remember when we talk about economics, it's not just economics. There's always something else also going on in the background. So listeners, once again, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. Please leave your comments below. Please share this episode, whether you agree with everything or not. Please get it out as widely as possible. If you've read Rand stuff, please leave comments below of essays you'd like me to talk about in the future, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you. Bye.